Once upon a time, when people used the term hybrid in reference to the automobile, they were not talking about a gas-electric hybrid, but a European-American hybrid. More specifically, a car that combined European handling and style with American muscle, typically in the form of a big, powerful V8 engine. Prior to World War II, it was not uncommon for smaller manufacturers to purchase drivetrains from bigger ones, even from overseas, such as the Graham-powered Boyson, an American-powered French car. Naturally, the war in Europe put a stop to a lot of trade, and post-war European car production would refocus on smaller, more economical engines. But the growing sports car market made for other options. London-based Allard got its start making replicas using Ford V8s and Lincoln V12s, reforming after the war as the Allard Motor Company, creating their own bodywork over modified chassis based on the Ford Pilot. Initially, models included the 100-inch wheelbase J-Series sports car, the bigger 106-inch wheelbase K-Series touring roadster, and the 112-inch wheelbase L-Series four-passenger Phaeton, with prices starting under £1,000. The standard engine on most being a 3.6-liter 221 Ford V8 with 85 horsepower, moving the K1 to around 80 miles an hour. But the J1 was intended for racing, and used a bigger 3.9-liter 239 Mercury engine tuned to 100 to 150 horsepower. Soon bigger engines were offered, including an 110 horsepower 4.4-liter 267 Mercury V8, and new body styles such as the Drophead M Series. In 1950, a P-Series passenger car was added, and even included a Safari Woody Wagon variant. And as popularity grew in the U.S., they would be shipped engineless to have the drivetrain of your choice installed from providers such as Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, with Cadillac engines becoming increasingly more popular. Styling would be updated for the various models in 1952, with the closed versions looking much different than the sportier models, which would include the K2 Corvette Killer, a version that used a 331 Chrysler Hemi with dual forebarrels, although only 62 would be built. But other companies were offering more advanced cars for less money, and Allard was effectively broke by 1958. When French car body fabricator Facel started building complete cars of their own, starting in 1954, they turned to Chrysler for V8s to power their new Vega, initially using an 180 horsepower 4.5-liter 276 DeSoto Fire Dome Hemi in a car that was 180 inches long on a 104-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,800 pounds, which put the car in the low 18s with a top speed around 115 miles an hour. The engine soon increased to a 200 horsepower 4.8-liter 291, putting it in the high 17s. The Facel Vega Sport pushed it up to 250 horsepower, moving the car beyond 130 miles an hour. Then a mild 5.4-liter 331 Hemi was added for 1956, initially with only 255 horsepower, followed the next year by a 5.8-liter 354 Hemi with a whopping 325 horsepower, making for a sub-15-second quarter mile. 1958 added the Excellence luxury sedan to the line, 206 inches long on a 125-inch wheelbase and 4,500 pounds, initially with a Chrysler 6.4-liter 392 Hemi with 360 horsepower. But soon the availability of Hemi V8s would dry up, forcing Facel to switch to the 5.9-liter 361 big block wedge. Horsepower was down to 335, but the cars gained available disc brakes, and prices were roughly $13,000. In the early 1960s, Facel would expand into smaller, cheaper four-cylinder sports cars. But the Facel 2 of 1962 used a Chrysler 6.3-liter 383 rated at 355 horsepower, and was advertised as the world's fastest four-seat passenger car. In spite of an increase of features, it could exceed 150 miles an hour and do the quarter mile in under 14 seconds. Reliability issues of the smaller cars would kill the company, but the big Chrysler V8 models would continue through 1964, with up to a 6.7-liter 413, with only 22 examples of this 390 horsepower version being made. After the Bristol Airplane Company became part of the British Aircraft Company in 1960, Bristol Cars was sold off to become an independent manufacturer. and increasing the size of the BMW-derived straight six was no longer enough to retain a sporty image of the increasingly heavy cars. So for the new 407 of 1961, they started with a Plymouth 260 V8, swapping out the poly heads for ones of their own design, and then increasing the bore and stroke to make a 5.1-liter 313, producing 250 horsepower for a mid-16-second quarter mile and speeds near 115 miles an hour, from a car that cost over 5,100 pounds, and only 88 were made. After the car was updated to become the 408, the engine would increase to a 5.2-liter 318. That would carry over to the softer riding 409. In fact, the 410 arrived the same year Chrysler switched to the LA small block 318. But Bristol continued on using their version of the earlier A-block engine. Soon, however, they would lose access to the bare block, and with the 411 of 1969, they moved to the big block Chrysler, initially a 6.3-liter 383, raising horsepower to 335, making it a 15-second car capable of 140 miles an hour. For 1974, it switched to a 6.6-liter 400 and net ratings for 264 horsepower, with a similar top speed and still in the high 15s, an engine which carried over to the 412 that arrived a year later. It was joined in 1976 by the 603, which came in two packages. The Economy, which used the LA 318 providing 145 net horsepower, and the Sport, which used the bigger 5.9-liter 170 horsepower 360, an 18-second car with a top speed of 120. For 1978, the 412 would also move to the 170 horsepower 360, providing similar performance, with both cars being little changed until the mid-90s. Their replacement, the Bristol Blenheim, would continue with a version of the same engine, which was now referred to as the Dodge 5.9-liter Magnum V8, and power started at 228 horsepower, making it a 16-second car capable of 125 miles an hour, and power would increase rapidly to 261 horsepower in 1998, with an optional 345 horsepower version a year later, then 385 horsepower in 2003, and 394 horsepower in 2006. And Bristol would introduce the Fighter in 2002, 174 inches long on a 108-inch wheelbase, and 3,400 pounds, using the 8-liter 488 cubic inch V10 from the Dodge Viper, producing 525 horsepower, putting the car in the high 11s with a top speed near 215 miles an hour, with a 628 horsepower version arriving in 2004, then a 1,012 horsepower version in 2006. But Bristol Automotive would go into liquidation in 2011. For 1962, the British Jensen replaced their 541 Grand Touring Coupe with the CV8, a car that was 184 inches long on a 105-inch wheelbase and just over 3,400 pounds, initially powered by Chrysler's 5.9-liter 361 B-block wedge V8, producing 305 gross horsepower, moving the car to around 135 miles an hour and a high 14-second quarter mile. For 1964, the engine increased to a 6.3-liter 383 with 330 horsepower, putting it in the mid-14s. Roughly 500 of the cars would be built before it was replaced in 1966 by the much better known Interceptor. It was slightly longer at 188 inches long on the same 105-inch wheelbase, weighing 3,500 pounds, and using a 325 horsepower version of the 383, for a car that would do the low 14s and more than 130 miles an hour. For 1970, horsepower was raised to 335, or 270 net, but changes in the engine for use with low-octane unleaded fuel reduced power for 1971. So Jensen switched to the bigger 7.2-liter 440, offered in 305 horsepower 4-barrel or 330 horsepower 6-pack versions, although the 6-pack was offered for only 1 year, with just over 230 being made, leaving the 280 net horsepower version as the only engine, which was down to 225 by the time Jensen went into receivership in 1976, with a total of just over 6,400 being made. although the Interceptor would be revived for a time in the mid-80s, using Chrysler's 5.9-liter 360, producing 240 horsepower, a mid-16-second car still capable of exceeding 130 miles an hour. The Apollo GT was an Italian-bodied sports car built by Coach Builder International Motors from 1963 to 1965, a car that was 175 inches long on a 97-inch wheelbase and weighed only 2,300 pounds, initially powered by a 3.5-liter 216 Buick V8, making it the 3500 GT. Base price was $6,000, horsepower was 225, and the top speed was claimed to be 150 miles an hour. Soon, a 5000 GT became available, using the bigger 4.9-liter 300 cubic inch V8, providing 250 horsepower. 42 of the original cars were sold, but it would later be sold as the Vetta Ventura, with a few dozen more being made. Italian coach builder Ghia built 57 examples of the 450 SS in 1966 and 67, sharing its mechanicals with the Plymouth Barracuda S. Although Ghia built bodies for numerous manufacturers, this was more of an in-house project, backed by producer Burt Sugarman of the Midnight Special, among other things. 178 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase and 3,100 pounds, the 5.4-liter 273 Chrysler small block produced 235 horsepower, for a top speed of 125 and a quarter mile in the low 16. Although Shelby might be better known today for its modified Mustangs, it got its start dropping Ford V8s into the English AC Ace, starting with the 260 horsepower 4.3-liter 260 in 1962, in a car that was 152 inches long on a 90-inch wheelbase and 2,100 pounds, making for a high 13-second car capable of 140 miles an hour. But the engine quickly grew to a 275 horsepower 4.7-liter 289. And updates and modifications would lead to the Mark II, and would include a new longer Daytona Coupe version, and the Mark III, the wide-body 7-liter 427 powered version, with 355 to 485 horsepower, depending on the application. An absolute monster that would hold the record as the world's quickest road car for more than 20 years. A non-competition version was a low 12-second car, with a top speed around 140. The car was also sold as the AC Cobra, but the styling would be updated with the introduction of the Mark III in 1965 to create the AC Frau. Stretched to 176 inches long on a 95-inch wheelbase, it was still under 3,200 pounds. In 1968, it switched to the Ford 428, rated at 345 horsepower. It could be had for $5,600, and 81 would be built before production ended in 1973. British manufacturer Sunbeam would follow Shelby's lead and drop the Ford 260 into their Alpine Roadster in 1964 to create the Tiger. 156 inches long on an 86-inch wheelbase, it was 2,500 pounds. With 164 horsepower, it could do a 16-second quarter mile and nearly 120 miles an hour. In 1967, a more powerful 4.7-liter 289 with 200 horsepower became available, putting it in the low 15s. But it was the final year of the Tiger. De Tomaso of Italy started building Ford-powered sports cars with the 4-cylinder Vallelunga in 1964. But things started to get serious with the mid-engine Mangusta of 1967, suggesting it was a Cobra killer. It was 168 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase and only 2,900 pounds. Although some early models were fitted with a 302 horsepower 4.7-liter 289, most would have a more mundane 4.9-liter 302 with 230 horsepower, with a significant difference in performance. A low 13-second car capable of 150 versus a mid 14-second car doing little more than 115. Just over 400 cars would be built by 1971 when it was replaced by the Pantera, perhaps the best-known car on this list. It was 168 inches long on a 99-inch wheelbase and 3,100 pounds, powered by a 5.8-liter 351 Cleveland, producing 310 to 326 horsepower, making it a low 13-second car capable of speeds near 160. The same year, De Tomaso introduced the Deauville luxury sedan, using the same engine. It was 191 inches long on a 109-inch wheelbase and 4,300 pounds. Still a mid-15-second car, capable of more than 145 miles an hour. Nearly 250 would be made over 15 years. And it was quickly joined by a smaller two-door Grand Touring version called the Longchamp, only 181 inches long on a 102-inch wheelbase and 4,000 pounds. It would run longer, and they would sell more than 400. In Europe, there would soon be a more powerful Pantera GTS with 345 horsepower, and a 207 horsepower 3-liter V6 version, with US models being sold through Lincoln Mercury dealers. But by the mid-70s, Ford would stop importing it, and soon stop US production of the Cleveland engine, meaning De Tomaso would start getting them from Australia. But they would still have to switch to a 351 Windsor in the mid-80s, and then to the 302 in its final few years. Its replacement, the Gara, initially used BMW-sourced parts, including its 4-liter V8. But when that engine was canceled, a Ford engine returned for 1999, in the form of a supercharged 4.6-liter modular V8, giving it a minor increase to 316 horsepower. It was 165 inches long on a 103-inch wheelbase and 3,100 pounds, for speeds close to 135 miles an hour and a quarter mile in under 13 seconds. It was supposed to be replaced by a new Mangusta, but that car would instead be released by Qual. Still called the Mangusta, it was 165 inches long on a 105-inch wheelbase and 3,400 pounds. It used a 320 horsepower version of the 4.6-liter Ford V8 and was capable of a low 13-second quarter mile and a top speed of 160. Even TVR, another British firm, used a Ford 4.7-liter 289 from the Mustang in the Griffith from 1964 to 1967, offered in 195 or 271 horsepower tunes, in a car that was 153 inches long on a 90-inch wheelbase and around 2,400 pounds, making it a low 15-second car capable of 155 miles an hour. The Gordon-Keeble 1 came about after an attempt to drop the engine from a Chevrolet Corvette into the British Peerless. The result would be a car that was 184 inches long on an 102-inch wheelbase and using a 5.4-liter 327, producing 300 horsepower, and weighed less than 3,200 pounds. It was a low 14-second car able to exceed 140 miles an hour, and underpriced at 2,800 pounds. 100 would be produced from 1964 to 1967. The Italian Iso Automobiles may be best known as the creator of the Isetta microcar, later made popular by BMW. But during the 60s and 70s, they would make a number of Chevrolet-powered Grand Tours, starting with the Revolta 300 in 1962, a car that was 187 inches long on a 106-inch wheelbase, weighing 3,500 pounds, and powered by the 300 horsepower 5.4-liter 327. And it managed a low 15-second quarter mile and a top speed near 140. And from 1968 to 1970, there was a 350 horsepower version. It was soon joined by the sportier Grippo, developed in two versions, the A3 Luxo or Luxury and the A3 Competition. But a fallout in the company ended up splitting the production of the two, with the competition model becoming the Bizzarini Strada, which actually went into production first, and was 176 inches long on a 96-inch wheelbase and 2,600 pounds, while the Lusso was 174 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase and initially 3,200 pounds, both using the Chevy 327. But for 1968, it would gain an available 7-liter 427 with 435 horsepower, putting it in the mid-13s. The Fidia full-size sedan was added the same year, 196 inches long on a 112-inch wheelbase and 3,600 pounds, initially also with the 327, but for 1969 switched to the 5.7-liter 350 with the same 300 to 350 horsepower versions. When the original Revolta would be replaced by the Lella, 183 inches long on a 109-inch wheelbase and 3,500 pounds, with the 327 carrying over, but it would soon also switch to the 350, as did the base Grippo. Then in 1970, the 427 version would become a 7.4-liter 454 version, and a sleeker Can-Am version would become available. In 1972, the cars would transition to a 330 gross horsepower version of Ford's 351 Cleveland, but 1974 would be end of the line for the ISO Revolta cars. The Swiss Monteverdi High Speed was a line of supercars powered by big block Chryslers starting in 1967. It was offered in 2-seat 375S, 2+2 375L, and later as the 4-door 375-4, and would include several specially styled versions. The S was 182 inches long on a 98-inch wheelbase, the L 189 inches long on a 106-inch wheelbase, and the 4 209 inches long on a 125-inch wheelbase. Power came from a 7.2-liter 440 rated at 375 horsepower for a quarter mile in the mid-14s and speeds around 155 miles an hour. They would stay in production through 1976 when they were effectively replaced by the Monteverdi Sierra, which was essentially an Italian-bodied Dodge Aspen, of which 2 convertibles, 5 wagons, and possibly 15 sedans were made. It was 192 inches long on a 112-inch wheelbase and around 3,600 pounds, with your choice of 5.2-liter 318 or 5.9-liter 360, providing 156 to 178 horsepower, making it a high 17-second car capable of over 120 miles an hour, and being the last Chrysler-powered Monteverdi. Intermechanica had used small European Ford engines before, but the 1967 Torino was the first to use an American Ford V8. It was 173 inches long on a 95-inch wheelbase and 2,600 pounds, and renamed Italia for 1968 due to conflict with Ford's use of the Torino name, initially using a 271 horsepower K-Code 4.7-liter 289, moving to a 250 horsepower 4.9-liter 302 for 1969, then a 310 horsepower 5.8-liter 351 Cleveland for 1970. Early versions could do a mid-14-second quarter mile and around 150 miles an hour, while later versions were high 13-second cars able to do 135. They would end production in 1971, and Bitter would effectively take over where they left off with the CD of 1973. It was 191 inches long on a 106-inch wheelbase, weighing 3,800 pounds, and in spite of the late period, used a 5.4-liter Chevrolet 327, rated at 227 horsepower. It could do nearly 140 miles an hour, and was a low 16-second car, with few changes through the end of the decade. Future bidders would continue to source parts from GM, but Opel instead of Chevrolet. This wasn't the end of such collaborations, but it certainly would become less common. Although Swedish brand Koenigsegg started using Ford V8s in 2002, Alfa Romeo made the Dodge Viper-powered TZ3 Stradale in 2011, before the two companies were fully merged. The Scania GTA Spano, that arrived the following year, was also powered by the Viper V10. Of course, some of these cars would edge into the much more common realm of platform sharing and badge engineering, but the idea of a best of both worlds type of car may very well come around again. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.